This week, we welcome Robert Dickinson, Vice President of Engineering at Graylog, to discuss the top 5 myths about API security and what to do instead. Then, in the enterprise security news, 11 funding rounds, lots of money flying around last week. Big ID becomes the first new security unicorn in a long time. AI still dominates early stage startups coming out of stealth. Zscaler makes an acquisition. Cisco completes an acquisition. Let's see, cybersecurity IPO rumors are starting to begin. Airbus calls off an acquisition. And is quantum computing another big thing that never shows up? All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
Identity is at the core of every great digital experience. Ping Identity's solutions support the scale, flexibility, and resiliency required by enterprise-level IT teams for lasting digital transformation. With 99.99% uptime and over 3 billion identities under management, they're the only identity vendor that's proven to champion the scale, performance, and security of large enterprises. That's why Ping Identity champions your unique identity needs. They give you the tools to offer your users the right access at the right times, no matter how they connect with you. Visit securityweekly.com/ping identity to learn more. 2024 will be the year of cryptography, driven by compliance requirements like PCI DSS 4.0 and the long-awaited NIST-standardized post-quantum algorithms. No longer can enterprises take their cryptography for granted. Cipher Insights from Quantum Exchange brings clarity to cyber risk blind spots that other point-and-scan solutions miss. The continuous network monitoring and response tool flags, scores, and prioritizes dozens of crypto risk factors in near real time, displayed through a single user-friendly dashboard for efficient management and remediation. Empower your NOC and SOC teams with actionable intelligence. Demonstrate proof of strong encryption required for zero trust. Gain the visibility and crypto inventory needed to begin your quantum-safe journey. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/quantum exchange.
Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Farm Rescuer Day. It's not the one Adrian recommended, but I'll tell you why in a second. This is episode number 354, recorded March 21st, 2024. I'm your host, Matt Alderman, filling in for Adrian. Joining me for this interview segment today is Darwin Salazar. Dude, it is so good to see you.
Howdy. Yeah, full circle. Started in 2018 as an intern, and fast forward 6-7 years here as a part-time host, and happy to be with the crew again and to be discussing API security. This should be a fun one.
Yeah, this will be a fun one. So I picked National Farm Rescuer Day because my stepfather is a farmer. Adrian always likes to pull in the national days. He gave me another one. There's a few of them today. I think it's also National Memory Day and a couple others. There's always multiples to choose from, in case you didn't know. Google has announced that they will be shutting down the Google Podcast platform in mid-2024. To ensure that you don't lose access to the Security Weekly content that you know and love, please make sure you subscribe to your favorite podcast feeds on an alternative platform such as Spotify, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to find the buttons to subscribe to each of our shows. This segment is sponsored by Graylog. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/Graylog. Rob Dickinson started Resurface, now Graylog API Security, to provide a true first-party solution for API monitoring and alerting based on open standards, both minimal assembly required. Having worked at Dell and Intel, plus a few early-stage startups, has given Rob a unique perspective on big data and API security and deep empathy for the challenges that API providers face. Rob, welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
All right, so we're going to get into API security, but we should set the table first before we dig into all the really cool stuff. So I see APIs kind of from two perspectives. One, as a platform provider myself, I use APIs to integrate with solutions. So think about I'm connecting to APIs, but I also offer up APIs that people connect to me. And this is how the world is communicating these days, is APIs across different applications is how a lot of business and a lot of data is flowing these days. Is there a specific angle that we should think about when it comes to API security, or do we have to think about both angles?
Well, I think actually to really understand the security implications, the first thing you have to do is really acknowledge why we're doing this to begin with. Why are we embracing APIs? Why have APIs taken over? And that's something that's very difficult to get a sense of, like just by going to Wikipedia and looking up what API and seeing what the letters stand for and hoping that tells you something. Like this is really the fundamental thing that we keep hearing from folks when we talk about this. Like, we know this is happening, but kind of I don't even understand why. I can't see these things. I know they're used for integrations. So like you said, generally that's part of the conversation. But there's really not, I think, a great understanding of the overall landscape here. So how I like to think of this is that we're moving over time here. We're moving from very tight, vertically integrated stacks like the ERP systems of old or the big office suites that we used to use. But that idea where it all comes from one vendor, it all comes from one provider, it's all tightly vertically integrated, and it's very monoculture oriented, to what we're doing with APIs, which is really about composable software. I'm going to take some bits from over there, I'm going to take some functions from over there, and I'm going to make my own thing with it. And I'm going to bring some of my own APIs along with that too. So it's much more like, if you think about in music, we went from classical music, which is very patriarchal, very vertically oriented. There's one person at the center kind of directing everything. APIs is more like jazz. I'm going to bring my stuff. You're going to bring your stuff. We're going to see how this mashes together. If that doesn't work, we'll try something different. Maybe we'll bring in some horns. Maybe we'll bring in some other players. And it's the combination of all that and the ability to experiment with that, figure out what doesn't work, leave the stuff that doesn't work behind, and move on to the exciting parts, and being able to do that in a very dynamic and in a way that isn't as intentionally directed as we used to see with kind of those very this very vertically integrated monocultures.
The monoliths, yes,
The monoliths.
yes, of days of old. And we see this not only in normal software, we see it in our own security space as well, like the whole best of breed. Like I have to integrate all this stuff together. And so it doesn't matter really the industry segment. Everybody is looking at how to integrate these different pieces to oh, compose an application or a service offering or something along those lines, right, Rob?
Yes, absolutely. And I think when you're thinking about APIs in terms of composable pieces of software, that's getting you on the right track as far as now thinking about the new security implications that come with that, right? Because my old monoliths, I would just control access to that, and then everything inside that secure perimeter is probably okay, right? And I was also very, very aware of what portions of that stack were actually available to the outside world, usually just the very top, right? But when we're talking about APIs, we're talking about the UI layer, the middleware layer, the database layers, the business processing objects. All those things have APIs. They're all addressable. So all of those represent opportunities to compose new kinds of software. But now we have to think about the security at each of those boundaries. And that's a very, very new thing, especially for folks that are following kind of the Amazon blueprint. Let's take everything that used to be internal and make it external, right? That essentially erases your notion of a secure perimeter, or at least forces you to reevaluate what that really means. But you can't just draw a safe moat around the whole thing and call it good anymore. These APIs want to be open, and they don't want to be closed. They're more valuable if they're open. They're more valuable if they're broadly consumed. That really puts the notion of tight perimeter security on its ear.
Yeah, which also leads, I think, into the 5 myths around API security as well, right? Because they want to be open. They're not closed. You can't control them just by access anymore. Like in the old days, this is a big old mainframe. We threw it in a data center. We just didn't let anybody in there except for a few people that needed to get in there. That is not this world at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so one of the myths that we talk about is this idea that your attackers are all outside, and they may be in another country that we don't like. Like that's something that you hear a lot. But when you look at the modern attack vectors, a lot of those attacks originate from inside the organization. They're actually insider attacks, or they're supply chain attacks, where the way that that's brought into the supply chain ends up being brought into the secure perimeter. We also see vectors like attackers who will literally sign up for a service as a customer in order to get access and get through the firewall and see what they can get to. Whether that's them doing it themselves or whether that's taking over a valid user account, again, in order just to go right through the perimeter. And so it's kind of like, in Ocean's 11, it's kind of like, like the first thing you do if you want to break into a bank is you open a safety deposit box at the bank and you can get in there and take a look at the vault, right? A lot of the attacks that we see, one of the places where they start is that attacker actually signs up, in some cases as a paying customer, for the privilege of getting in there.
Yeah, because I see vendors now, because I do a lot of integration work, where you can't get access to the APIs or the documentation unless you are a customer, right? They're really starting to lock these down. And so it makes the integration conversation harder, but I assume that's partially the reason is they want to secure the access to those APIs to only their customers, which means you have to be a paying customer to get access to them. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's still kind of, I mean, it's not nonsense, right? There is logic to that, but you're still kind of holding on to that idea of a secure perimeter and being able to keep out the outsiders, right? Because we hear that a lot. We hear people that say things like, well, yeah, we've got this API, but it's only supposed to be used by this one integration account that we have, or we have this API and it's only supposed to be used by our mobile app. Well, guess what? The attackers don't care. If you can find that API running by scanning IP addresses on Azure or on AWS, for example, if you can find that endpoint, I don't care if I'm using the mobile app or not. That's something that's available either way. So it's very comfortable, and it's also been it still is good security practice to enforce whatever perimeters you can. I don't mean to come across as like the idea of perimeters doesn't apply anymore, but you really have to think about how those perimeters are being redrawn, and the fact that if anything's running in a public cloud environment, it doesn't matter your intent. People are going to be able to get to that.
Yeah, and I have a question, Rob. When it comes to thinking the fact that APIs are everywhere, and it doesn't matter which business unit we're talking about, whether it's HR or a security team or your DevOps teams, they're all working with APIs or SaaS applications that may have exposed APIs, whether internally or externally, applications that have to talk to each other, and these applications host sensitive data that are attractive to attackers. So APIs are a necessary evil. They're integral to how we do business today. They're not going away anytime soon. But say I'm a CISO stepping into the first 90 days at a company, and I need to come up with an inventory of where all of my APIs are. How do I, go about that, doing the discovery and inventorying these APIs?
Yeah, that's absolutely a top of mind concern for almost everyone that we talk to. And I think we have to acknowledge that APIs are great, they're very flexible, they're very powerful, like that definitely is the way that everything is going. But at the same time, we have taken a huge step back in terms of visibility. So when our businesses were based on websites and web forms and email flows and things like that, if you think about it, anyone in the organization, from the CEO down to someone in QA or account management or whatever, was able to go to the website, fill out a form. Did I get the right email? Did the buy funnel work? Like, what is it that we're doing? All that. And that was one of the things that was great about the web, was that suddenly all these business practices weren't just something that sales saw. Like, kind of everybody in the organization could see what the checkout flow was like and whether that worked. But now we've gone over to APIs, and these APIs are fundamentally dark. They're owned by development. So, of course, I say this with love, but there's gatekeeping there. Like, we know that. There's gatekeeping by the developers. Maybe QA knows how that stuff is supposed to work, and they're providing a check, but it's not atypical that outside of development and maybe a few people in security, literally nobody in the organization knows how many APIs are there, when they're changing, what they're used for. And we hear this all the time. We hear folks say things like, yeah, I can see that there's data flowing through my network to these endpoints, but I don't know if that's good. I don't know if that's bad. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure how to measure it. And the short answer there is, you need tools that are built to solve this problem. You unfortunately, you can't just grab a browser. You can't just grab Insomnia or Postman and figure it all out yourself. That's too high of a technical bar for most folks. So you really need tools that help with the discovery, and then are publishing or making available that high level inventory. The only other way that we see people approaching that is they say, we'll approach it from the development perspective. We'll make sure that development has a catalog of all the open API specs, or all the specs that they're actually developing, and we'll start from kind of that design side inventory, and we'll try to apply that. But obviously, there's challenges with that as well, because what you did in design doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening in production. So we really feel like having dedicated tools that really help you discover not only the infrastructure behind your APIs, but also the activity on those APIs and the threats and risks that are associated with that is a huge problem to solve.
So, Rob, is it a combination of kind of like DAST, kind of dynamic application security testing, specifically looking for open APIs on the runtime side, married with some sort of static analysis in the code base? Like, is that how this inventory gets kind of built? Like, am I on the right track, or is there something more magical to it?
No, those are the kind of the classical ways of doing it, and those are still good recommendations. If you're not doing anything else, then definitely do that. And a lot of that traditionally comes through pen testing. And so routine pen testing, we'll pen test every so often. That's how we'll discover kind of what's out there, or audit what's out there. Again, that's still a good thing to do if you're not doing it. But the challenges there are that these APIs are changing very, very quickly. So even if you're auditing them once a quarter, even if you think you're auditing them pretty darn often, like from a corporate governance or corporate compliance perspective, they're still being changed hundreds of times between each auditing cycle. And that's something right now we've all kind of agreed that we're going to turn a blind eye to. But when you look at how attack vectors are actually being exercised by these bad actors that are out there, it's frequently things like an endpoint was misconfigured, it wasn't behind the gateway, it didn't have authentication on it, and it sits out there for a few days until someone finds it, and then they steal out all the customer records. That was essentially the Optus hack in Australia, right? A misconfiguration. That kinds of things can happen all the time. And development and operations are under tremendous pressure to ship more often, stand up new integrations more easily. The fact that these are APIs, you can just throw them out there and see who uses them, also encourages you to move faster. So yes, you can try to ramp up how often you're doing pen testing. You can try to ask your developers to be more disciplined about publishing their changes. We really feel like, and you see more API security vendors kind of taking this posture. We really feel like monitoring the actual production traffic, that's the real source of truth here about what's going on. And of course, you want to square that with your inventory and what you hoped you had. But the almost unanimous reaction that we get when we show people what their APIs are actually doing is surprise. I didn't know my customers would do that. I didn't know my attackers would do that. I didn't know my systems would handle failures that way. I didn't realize we were vulnerable to those kinds of misconfigurations. And how would you know if you're not actually monitoring at that level?
Right. So let's talk about that a little bit because it leads into the other myth around attacks are rare, but it also leads to this concept of, because I see this happening in the market right now, right? I'm seeing this combination of web application firewalls and API security. Is that what you mean by monitoring the traffic flow? That there is kind of a gateway or a flow that allows you to see what communications are coming through on those APIs and using that, for lack of a better term, WAF slash API gateway approach to do that monitoring, or is it
Yes.
something? Okay.
Yeah, it's really that simple, right? And I can tell you the premier digital properties that are out there today, like Apple and Bank of America and folks like that. Um, they know whether their web pages are rendering correctly. They know whether their API calls are working right because they have a record of each and every one of those. This has actually been a standard of care in the web world for a long time, because if someone fails at the end of a shopping cart on a checkout process on the web, you want to know what was in their shopping cart so you can reach out to them and recover those sales, right? This really is not a completely new idea. We're basically just saying that we need tools that do that for APIs, that have the knowledge of APIs and that domain kind of infused into that. Another way of thinking about this, more in terms of just trying to understand the concept, is a lot of times we'll try to make analogies in the physical world. So let's pretend that I'm going to my bank, and I go to my bank, and there's a security guard at the front door of the bank, and he looks at me and he says, "Okay, it doesn't look like you're an attacker. You go ahead on into the bank." That's basically the firewall or the WAF that's sitting ahead of your APIs, right? So it's looking at, do you look like a bad actor? If you don't look like a bad actor, okay, you're good. So you need that bouncer or that security guard. But can you imagine if you went to your bank and you did that, but then once you got inside, it was the honor system. You could access whatever safety deposit box you wanted, and there would be no record of what money you withdrew from any particular account. There'd be no record or no logging of that at all. Unfortunately, that is where a lot of digital properties are today with their APIs. They have that security guard at the front door, but once somebody gets inside the building, it's the honor system. And that wouldn't work in a bank, right? It also doesn't work if half the people that show up at your bank intend to rob that bank. And this is actually what we see online now. So this is one of the other myths about attackers being rare. About half or more of the traffic that you're going to see on your APIs, especially if that's running in a public cloud, could be from attackers or from bad actors. So imagine now if I go to my bank, and the bank that security guard at the front door expects half the people are there to rob the bank. You're going to have to run your bank in a very, very different way than you would have thought of it before. But but certainly we're in a place where the honor system is not going to work for us anymore. We have to acknowledge that these attackers are well funded, they're intelligent, they're creative, they're motivated, and frankly, there's a lot of money to be made as a bad actor out there. And so you need your WAF, you need your perimeter security, but what NIST and OWASP have been talking about a long time is layered security. And you can't just rely on your WAF to solve all the problems. You need that observability layer inside the building. You need that surveillance camera, that audit trail inside the building to know what these folks are actually doing and if that was right.
Right. And you highlight a key point there, Rob, that even if these API endpoints are properly configured and you have a very strong, the most expensive WAF on the market, if an attacker is able to get through your four walls and they're able to interact with that API, they can essentially exfiltrate data or manipulate it in a certain way, whichever way they would like. If other protections are not in place, right? Because they're already authenticated and authorized to make those to take those actions against the endpoint. So that observability and monitoring, that continuous aspect of looking over what these API endpoints are doing and how they are behaving to detect any anomalies or throttling or whatever the case may be, I think that's extremely key. And so I want to ask a question around, everybody has AI fatigue today, right? But it's a real thing. It's a very real thing. So I wanted to ask, what are you seeing in the wild? Have you seen any attackers adopting AI or Gen AI to come up with like novel or more sophisticated type of attacks against APIs?
It's hard to quantify because I think from the blue team perspective, these just look like API calls, right? And I always kind of giggle when I hear people talk about bot detection in the context of APIs because like isn't everything that's calling my API a bot? Like everything that's calling my API is a piece of software. It's not a human on a browser or a giraffe or some other thing. Like they're all bots, right? So um, I think the AI vector here is that it's going to allow attackers to be more sophisticated and carry out more attacks per unit time. But I'm not sure that it's going to lead to like completely different kinds of attacks than we've seen before by virtue of having AI. Maybe I'll be looking back at this 2 years from now and saying how wrong I was. But I think a lot of what we've pictured is um, you could kind of train up the AI and then be able to carry out more attacks quicker without having to customize as much for the particular property. If I can hand off that AI an open API spec for the thing I'm trying to break into and have it do some of the heavy lifting of figuring out where the weak points might be, then I think there's a real opportunity there. I think there's also the mirror opportunity for that is on the blue team side, where for example, you could look at all the runtime traffic that you have and use AI to filter that down to these are the specific threats where data exfiltration is happening or accounts are being taken over, really beginning to those kinds of high value signals and doing that without as much manual effort to get there. So I do think there's opportunities for kind of both sides of that with AI, but I guess personally I see that more as just another way of accelerating or automating the things that people are already doing.
Copy. So attacks generally have stayed the same. We haven't noticed anything novel or noticeably more sophisticated, but the volume and the frequency has perhaps increased over the past year, let's say.
We certainly have seen there's been a huge uptick in the last few years around application level attacks, things like session takeovers, things related to permissions not being set properly, and so you do like permission escalations or getting rights to data that you shouldn't have been able to see, things like that at the application layer. There's definitely been a huge takeoff in that kind of activity. But to your point, these APIs are all web systems. And so they're all vulnerable to the same kinds of web vulnerabilities that we've been fighting for 20 years. So none of that stuff goes away. You still see SQL injection attacks on your APIs. You still see cross-site scripting and redirect behaviors being abused. All those kinds of things that you would think of as being web attacks, those still show up on your API stacks. But then you have these other things that are more specific to the API behaviors, and that's hard. Like, unfortunately, not a lot of folks that have a network security background or a network operations background don't are starting to learn more about the application side and those application behaviors, but that's a whole new zone to go into.
Yeah, so you brought it up a little bit around authentication, right? In authentication is one of the other myths here is that is sufficient,
Yep.
right? And you just said, look, you might have the wrong permissions. What are some of the things you should be doing with your APIs to secure them better if authentication and basic TLS encryption is not enough?
Yeah, so I met with a large. I won't out them, but I met with a large telecom provider last year, and we were talking about security, and we got about 15 minutes into the conversation, and they're basically like, "Yeah, we're not sure there's anything to talk about here. We think we're good. We have really strong authentication policies, and we that's all we need." That platform's been breached 6 or 7 times since we had that conversation. Um, so,
Oops.
and I mean like major breaches, like at the like telecom level, like imagining the customer set they have. Um, so yeah, like this is why security is hard, because security doesn't have just one answer at the end of the day. Like, you need a strong perimeter defense. You need in however you can frame that, you need good authentication, you need encryption, you need all those things. Like, all of those are completely mandatory, but the presence of those is not sufficient. Um, your authentication is great as long as it's configured and working properly. Your firewall or your WAF is great as long as it's configured and working properly. So that's one of the things that we like to ask is, well, how do you audit that your authentication was right? These systems are very fragile, and we're changing them very quickly. And at least 40% of the breaches that we see are actually due to misconfigurations or runtime behaviors. It wasn't that somebody wasn't using TLS. It was that there was something that was misconfigured or misdeployed and left a particular endpoint vulnerable. If you can't find that, discover that, and fix that, then it doesn't matter that all of your other things were properly authenticated. So this is just one of the things, as you guys know about security, that's so hard. Like, the blue team has to be perfect 100% of the time. The attackers can just get lucky. But a lot of this really comes from the fragility of the systems, how quickly they're being changed, and it's not because the organization was just dumb and they didn't know about authentication or they didn't know about TLS. They were doing all those things, but those things can break down. And if there isn't a way to independently audit that, then you're always going to be susceptible to finding those kinds of things, in the newspaper instead of finding it, on your own.
So Rob, let's start to think about how do we solve this, right? What is the right kind of approach that organizations? I mean, eh, Darwin asked a little bit about this with discovery, and I assume discovery is one of those first pieces. Like, you got to get an inventory of what you have, but then what does that next set of steps look like? How should companies kind of approach this, and then where does Graylog kind of really fit into that equation?
Yeah, so this is the part that it might sound a little self-serving because it's a little bit more vendor specific, but the Graylog perspective on this is we really believe that runtime monitoring at scale is really, that's the key missing component in most of the folks that we talk to in their security strategy. So almost everyone that we talk to has a WAF They're doing pen testing. They have one or more API gateways or other authentication systems that are helping with authentication, load shedding, and all those kinds of things, right? But they can't actually audit what their APIs are doing. And so what we're doing is we're saying, hey, let's use big data techniques and let's create a data warehouse or a data lake, whatever you want to call it. Let's create a database out of all that traffic that's going back and forth to the APIs. Just as if we were tapping the phone lines or, for, like tapping the phone lines for customer support, like how they say that when you call in to a help desk. It's that same thing. So now you have an actual system of record. We do that over a rolling time window. So we'll say, like, we'll help you gather that data for 6 months, and then the data older than that will tail off. And so then it gives you basically this window of time where you can move forwards and backwards, see where threats have arisen, how the system responded to that. You can then use that data lake for then all these different purposes. Discovery is the first one of those. So if I have a recording of all the API calls, of course I can put those together into buckets. Here was this API, here was that API, here's this prohibited API, here's this deprecated one that shouldn't be called anymore. Here's this rogue one that the development team stood up, but they didn't tell anyone else about that we're supposed to support now. So if you have those records, you can immediately use those records for kind of discovery and inventory purposes. You can also use that for threat detection and risk scoring, kind of through the same mechanism, because it's just a matter of kind of scoring and grouping those records together. And then also when it comes to the triage or the remediation, you have all of the detail of this is actually what happens step by step in these cases where we found. So you can start off with a discovery viewpoint, but then you can go all the way down to here's the specific change that needs to be made to the firewall to prevent this to happen, or here's the specific bug report that should go out to development to actually fix the system. And then through the data lake, we can see, did that fix actually take? Did it regress? And we can also apply automation to be looking for all those signals in the data lake so that our human analysts don't have to do all the work of discovering those threats and finding where all those things are. So again, it's a very simple idea that if you record all of the calls in production, then that opens up not just the discovery case, but almost any kind of case where you need to understand what was the exchange between the client and server, and did that have the right outcome for the business?
Yeah, so I equate it to like a network detection and response platform almost, right? I mean, instead of capturing all the packet information, you're actually looking at all the API calls. Very similar approach, right? You're just
Yes.
I imagine you are inspecting some level of network traffic to get some of this data too, as well. But you're storing this all from an API perspective, not necessarily what a traditional NDR would do, which is a lot of deep packet inspection.
Yes. Yeah. So the primary ways that we calculate or that we capture data is actually through packet sniffing,
Mhm.
just as you said. But the model that we're presenting to the user isn't a list of packets. It's a request, a response, and it's, this was REST, or this was GraphQL, or this was batched GraphQL, and having, knowledge at that level at the APIs. So you can actually do this from network monitoring. You can also do this from the API gateways themselves. So we work with folks like Tyke, for example. We can fork traffic off that Tyke is seeing, and we can provide kind of the observability sidecar for your existing Tyke implementation
Mm.
to get you to that point where you have a record of all the transactions that are going on.
Oh, that's really cool. I didn't, I've seen some of these solutions. I've seen this market kind of morph, but I didn't really think about packet capture as a way to monitor APIs. I was just thinking you do it at the gateways and you're done, right? Like I think that's what everybody, I guess, kind of thinks. But it's a really interesting approach because now you can see the communications, track those communications. I mean, obviously, Graylog is a large scale system to store this data. So, I mean, it makes sense that you have the scale behind you to actually support all these, because it would be lots of records, obviously.
Yeah, and that's and that's something that we hear a lot because this, like I said, this has been kind of a well kept secret in corporate America. I feel like for a while, a lot more folks are monitoring at this level than you might think. But it's not something that they talk about a lot publicly. But but if you ever like abandon your shopping cart and then you get an email back about like, hey, would you want to come back and complete, like, we'll give you a coupon, or like, you are being monitored, right? And as much as we hate being monitored online, I absolutely want my transactions monitored as soon as I put down my credit card. I want a record of that, like both ways, right? Um, so a lot of what we get, again, like the number one reaction that we hear once folks actually see their data is shock or surprise. I just didn't know. It never occurred to me that folks would use our stuff that way. Um, but to your point, we do talk to folks that say, well, geez, that must be really expensive. Like you're doing all this at scale. That must be horrible. That must cost millions of dollars. That must be, all kinds of services engagements to set that up and all that stuff. I mean, what we're using is very off the shelf, industry standard, big data tools to do this. And this is incredibly cost effective. This has actually been cost effective for a while. And we're not trying to gather like nation state level data sets. We're just talking about the data that comes off of, the typical API, in the typical environment. So it's actually very, very doable. We don't have to downsample. We don't have to drop details. We can do those things if we want to. If we want to sample the data and not capture as much, or if we want to drop specific details for privacy or security purposes, we can do that. But there's actually nothing holding you back from recording all this. And yeah, it sounds like a lot of data, but it's really not. I mean, terabytes of data is not really anything to manage if you're, if you're on AWS, you're just throwing all this out on S3 anyway.
Yes, you are. Or if you're on Azure, it's an Azure data lake and you're querying it via
Yep,
Synapse or whatever, right? So, yes, I mean,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah, the technology is definitely there now to do this, right? I never thought about this level of inspection from an API level before, but it makes sense, right? Because if you can't inspect what's happening across those APIs, how are you ever going to protect them better, or even know what's out there? Because discovery to me is still the hardest part of this, which is why I asked you to use a combination of DAS and static analysis. Well, no, just go inspect the traffic.
Yeah, and it's not to say there aren't. I mean, there are certainly other ways to think about discovery. I saw one really good presentation on discovery, which was basically, um, as a security person, you need to get access to your corporate GitHub or your GitLab or like wherever your developers are doing work, and like you surveil what the developers are doing in those environments to figure out when they're standing up new things. Or there's ways of, I can go and I can discover active infrastructure that's active on my network. And I don't mean to imply that those aren't worth doing. Like again, if that's what suits you best, then do that rather than do nothing. Um, but to your point, the actual end user traffic in production, that really is the single source of truth. Your QA team is trying to imagine what those folks are doing. Your developers and designers are trying to imagine what those folks are doing. Your security analysts, your pen testers, they're trying to imagine and predict and in some cases get ahead of those behaviors. But there's nothing like the security and the peace of mind of actually knowing that if something breaks or something went sideways, I have like 3 months to go and look at that. And if something broke for a particular customer or a particular client, I don't have to go and interview that client about what they were doing. I have everything I already need to understand exactly what happened better than they did. They don't have to give me error messages, right? Whether this is a customer support or pen testing. Pen testing, it's the same thing. Like if you have all those records on the back side, you don't need the report from the pen tester. You've actually got the live API calls.
Yeah, as they say, the network never lies. So you're right.
Absolutely.
Yep. And I think that, Rob, you highlight a key trend that's been taking place in the security space where we're finally adopting big data solutions like data lakes, the Snowflakes, Databricks, BigQueries to send off what would previously be high volume, very expensive logs and events to store. We now can send them to data lakes where, by the way, some of our data analytics folks and data science folks may already have access and may be using and may be experts in those solutions. And then we can come up with very advanced use cases to monitor this API calls or create a baseline that's tailored specifically to that application and that endpoint. And then it just opens up a world of opportunities in a cost-effective manner. And I just want to call out that's happening, but not a lot of people are talking about it. And I hopefully we continue to hear more of it and more examples. But for the API calls and storing all of that, I think it makes a lot of sense. So
It actually, Rob, just quickly, I can almost see that same data set being used, and I've talked about this before, around performance, API performance, right? Because it's kind of a combination of both, right? By understanding that data and the data flows and what's in them, it is solving a security use case, but it could also solve a performance use case. So I don't know if those are opportunities that you guys are starting to see now that you have the core data set, but I've always seen this potential for application performance monitoring, application security monitoring coming together more holistically because they're almost two sides of the same coin.
Yes, and we definitely hear that too. I think one of the key differences there is a lot of APM systems or performance management systems. Their focus is on the code and which areas of the code were slow. And then you take that and you try to put a high level SLA or high level metrics on top of it. And that's a reasonable thing to do. Just like you said, we're coming at this from a slightly different perspective because what we're actually monitoring is the end user perspective. So it's relatively easy for us to look at that and say, oh yeah, like if you were hoping this was going to complete in 5 seconds all the time, it didn't, and here's the case why. That certainly is an aspect to operational quality. The other thing that comes into that also is our cases where the API did respond and the performance was great and the response code was 200 and you just sold an airline ticket for 50 cents. Or that was an attacker and you handed that attacker back meaningful data. So again, you want to get to those high level indicators, more of those business indicator sense of, was this a successful transaction from the user perspective? And that's where performance is an aspect of that. Quality is kind of an aspect of that. The security posture and risk is another aspect of that. And just like you, once you go down this road of saying I have a data set that really encompasses all of that, I start to have trouble seeing where those boundaries lie exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thanks so much for having me. This is fun.
Yes, it was. To learn how to protect your APIs, please visit securityweekly.com/Graylog. Stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to go over the weekly enterprise security news.